If you ask me what amount changes an ordinary person's financial life more than almost any other early milestone, I would not say $1 million. I would not say $100,000 either. I would say 20,000. That number sounds almost too small to deserve respect in a world obsessed with giant balances, viral net worth screenshots, and retirement fantasies built around impossible round numbers. That is exactly why most people miss its importance. They think 20,000 is not enough to matter. They are wrong. It is not enough to make you rich. It is enough to make you harder to exploit. That is a much bigger shift than people realize. I have spent most of my life around capital, businesses, banks, markets, and the emotional machinery people build around money. The older I get, the less impressed I become with glamorous financial talk, and the more interested I become in the quiet thresholds that change how a person actually lives. This is one of those thresholds, not because it makes a person rich, because for a very large share of ordinary households, it marks the first time the system stops owning all the timing. That is what money is at the beginning. Timing control. The person with no reserve does not really own his own time. He is living inside a schedule designed by bills, employers, lenders, due dates, fees, and bad luck. His calendar is not his. His choices are not fully his. His mood is not fully his. Everything is tied to the next inflow. That is why I say the first 20,000 is not just savings. It is the first serious purchase of breathing room. Most people do not respect that because the culture trains them to think only in net worth theater. 100,000, $500,000, $1 million retirement. Passive income, fine. Those are later chapters. But if you skip the first real defensive threshold, the rest of the plan stays emotionally fragile, no matter how good it looks in a spreadsheet. That is what I want to explain. The public has been taught to treat $20,000 two different wrong ways. Poor people are taught to think it is impossibly far away. Middle-class people are taught to think it is not enough to matter. Both are mistakes. It is far enough to require discipline and close enough to be achievable. It is small enough that you can still waste it and large enough that it changes your life if you understand its job. That is the real issue. Not the number, the job. Most people who reach 20,000 for the first time immediately misunderstand the job. They think the number itself means the struggle is over. They begin mentally upgrading the life before they have built the system that can carry the upgraded life safely. That is how the floor turns back into vapor. This is the part nobody teaches. Hitting 20,000 is phase one, keeping it, protecting it, and turning everything above it into growth. And options is phase two, and phase two is where most people get eaten. Not because they are lazy, because the rules of the game change the moment they stop looking, obviously fragile. That is when the whole world starts selling harder. The bank notices, the card companies notice, the apps notice, the advertisers notice, the algorithms notice, your feed changes, your offers change, your limits change, your sense of what you deserve changes. This is what makes the first 20,000 so dangerous as well as so important. You become more stable at exactly the moment the world gets more aggressive about separating you from your stability. I want to tell you what 20,000 really buys. It buys the right to absorb a problem without turning the problem into a crisis chain. That is the first thing. A car repair is one expense. A car repair plus a credit card balance plus interest plus late fees plus a missed shift because the car stayed broken for another week is a system event. People who live without a reserve are not mainly harmed by single costs. They are harmed by the multiplication that happens after the first cost lands. That is why the number matters. At 20,000, many single shocks stop turning into system events. You pay, you handle it, you recover. The thing remains annoying. It does not become a spiral. That is an enormous change. Second, 20,000 buys you the right to say no slower. That sounds like a strange phrase until you have lived without it. Most bad financial decisions are not made by people who are stupid. They are made by people who are in a hurry. The mechanic says this financing offer is good for today only. The dealership says the rate changes tomorrow. The landlord says decide tonight. The employer says this is the compensation, and we need your answer now. The lender says this is your only option. The person with no reserve hears urgency and obeys because urgency owns him. The person with a reserve can wait. Waiting is one of the highest forms of power in finance. If you can take a day, compare offers, walk away, or refuse the panic frame, you stop paying the price of desperation. That is what 20,000 begins to buy, not luxury. Delay. Delay is incredibly valuable when the market around you makes enormous money from people who cannot delay. Third, it changes how institutions see you. Now, I do not mean this sentimentally. Banks are not in the business of admiring your discipline. They are in the business of pricing and monetizing your position. A thin customer is profitable in one way. A more stable customer is profitable in another way. But the first 20,000 often pushes you out of the most humiliating category, the overdraft category, the fee category, the revolving emergency credit category, the category where every error becomes chargeable. This is why I say banks love people who are not bankrupt but not comfortable. That condition is incredibly monetizable. A person who stays close to zero creates accidental revenue. An account that dips negative creates fee revenue. A household that uses cards as emergency reserves creates interest revenue. A borrower who cannot wait creates premium pricing. A person with no buffer is a small economic ecosystem of profitable stress. That is brutal language. It is also accurate. The bank does not need you destroyed. Destroyed customers create losses. It wants you slightly strained. Strained customers pay. This is why the first 20,000 matters so much. Once the reserve is real, you become less naturally profitable in all the worst ways. You are no longer the perfect overdraft candidate. You are less likely to carry the emergency balance. You are harder to push into bad short-term credit. You begin using products instead of being used by them. That is a much bigger change than people understand. Now, most people think that if 20,000 buys breathing room, then anything spent from it that improves life must be justified. This is how they lose the floor. They hit the number and immediately reinterpret the number. Not reserve, progress, not protection, permission. Then the mind starts talking. I can finally relax a little. I earned this trip. I can move somewhere nicer. I can upgrade the car. I can stop obsessing. I am finally not one of those people anymore. This is the dangerous sentence. I am finally not one of those people anymore. Because the moment you say that, you often stop doing the things that created the threshold in the first place. You stop tracking as tightly. You stop caring about renewals. You let subscriptions multiply. You loosen up on meals out. You accept small increases in lifestyle because each one looks manageable against the new balance. Then a few real-life hits arrive. And suddenly, the account that looked like safety is back at 7,000, 6,000, 4,000. And the nervous system realizes with horror that it mistook a foundation for a finish line. That is the entire tragedy. People do not lose the first 20,000 because they are irresponsible in some dramatic cinematic way. They lose it because the world turns a reserve into a trophy and they cooperate. So let me say something plainly. The first 20,000 should not be treated as available money. It should be treated as a line, a floor, a minimum structural threshold beneath which you do not casually go again. That sentence alone changes the whole psychology. Before the floor, you are climbing. After the floor, you are defending. Only after defense is credible does the growth layer deserve serious expansion. This is what I mean by phase 2. Layer 1 is the floor. Layer 2 is growth. Layer 3 is options. Most people mix all three and then wonder why nothing feels stable. Layer 1 is not for fun. It is not for lifestyle drift. It is not for proving adulthood. It is not for emotional reward after years of sacrifice. It is for survival with dignity. Rent, food, utilities, core insurance. Basic transportation, that is what the floor protects. Once that floor exists, then the next dollar above it becomes much more interesting because it can be assigned a different job. The growth layer buys future freedom. This is long-term investment capital. Index funds, retirement accounts, maybe later certain real assets, business ownership, or other productive machines inside your circle of competence. The point is not the exact product first. The point is the mental distinction. This money does not exist to calm the next emergency. The floor already does that. This money exists to buy the future. That difference matters because if you keep confusing emergency money with growth money, the portfolio never gets to do its work. Then comes the third layer, options. This is the part people either neglect or abuse. Abuse happens when every extra dollar becomes lifestyle decoration. Neglect happens when a person becomes so rigid that he never uses money to improve actual life or expand future possibility. That is foolish too. A course that genuinely raises earning power, a move to a better city, a short gap between jobs so you can take a better role instead of the first desperate one. A small investment in tools, health, relationships, or environment that materially improves your trajectory. These can be intelligent uses of money, but they must be above the floor. That is the rule. The floor is not to be negotiated with lightly. Now let us talk about why this threshold is so psychologically violent in a good way. Below it, every expense is interpreted as threat. Above it, some expenses become merely annoying. That shift sounds minor. It is life-changing. People with no reserve think differently, not because they are weaker in character, but because their minds are living in a tunnel. Tunnel thinking is one of the most expensive financial conditions in existence. It makes people take bad financing, bad jobs, bad lease terms, bad timing, bad relationship compromises, bad everything. Because tunnel thinking cannot afford long-horizon decisions. You do not think about 5-year optionality when next Tuesday feels uncertain. That is what the reserve cures first. Not scarcity in total, scarcity in time horizon. A longer horizon is one of the most valuable things money can buy. At zero savings, the horizon is days. At 2,000, maybe weeks. At 10,000, maybe a month or two. At 20,000 for many households, something new appears, a quarter, a season, a real buffer. That means the person can begin acting like a planner instead of a dodger. This changes work too. That is one of the most underappreciated effects of the first real reserve. A person with no cushion is not really negotiating at work. He is surviving at work. He may use professional language. He may pretend the relationship is mutual. He may say he is choosing patience. Sometimes he is just trapped politely. The person with a reserve can behave differently. He can say no to the absurd schedule. He can walk away from the insulting manager. He can search for the better role without the same panic. He can take the certification, build the side income, or accept the short-term income dip that leads to a better trajectory later. That is what people mean when they say money buys freedom. At the early level, freedom is not yachts. It is refusing the wrong. Yes, $20,000 starts buying that. Now, does that mean everyone should stop investing until they reach $20,000? Not exactly. I am not interested in turning sane sequencing into a rigid religion. If your employer match is on the table, capture it. If a retirement plan is easy and automatic, use it. But understand the hierarchy. If your household is structurally brittle, every invested dollar may later get yanked back out at the worst possible time because the base is too weak. That is why so many people feel cursed by money. They technically do some good things while their structure remains vulnerable enough to sabotage the good things on schedule. The reserve makes the good things stick. That is its real magic. Now, I can already hear the objection. 20,000 is a lot. Yes, that is why it matters. A meaningful threshold should be difficult enough to produce a different life on the other side. This is not a weekend challenge. This is a structural campaign. And because it is a campaign, it demands a different kind of seriousness. You do not build the first 20,000 with spare change culture and random enthusiasm. You build it through sequence. First, tell the truth. What are your actual monthly core costs? Not idealized costs, not shame-filtered costs, real costs. Second, know the gap. What is the real surplus between after-tax income and reality? If the answer is little or none, then you are not yet in the savings phase. You are in the redesign phase. The redesign phase is not failure. It is diagnosis. Income must rise, costs must fall, or both. That is not motivational. It is arithmetic. Third, automate the build. The future does not survive on leftovers. The transfer must happen before the month gets access to your emotions. Fourth, use windfalls correctly. Raises, bonuses, tax refunds, gift money, one-off gigs, sales of things you do not need. All of these are not lifestyle invitations while the floor is unfinished. They are accelerants. Fifth, protect against lifestyle drift while climbing. This matters more than people think because every small monthly increase delays the threshold. The coffee is not the issue. Fixed cost creep is the issue. Sixth, keep the story simple. You are buying your way out of being rushable. That is what the first 20,000 is. A person who cannot be rushed is financially more dangerous to exploit than one who can. That is a very useful way to think. Now, once the threshold exists, another temptation appears. The temptation to speed everything up. The account finally looks respectable. You open the brokerage app and now the graph has weight. 5 figures, maybe more. Then the internet begins whispering. Options, crypto, leverage, quick wins. Double it. Turn 20 into 200 fast. This is where many people commit the most painful mistake of all. They risk the floor trying to skip the middle. No, the floor belongs in boring safety. Cash treasuries. Very boring cash equivalents. Nothing spicy. Nothing clever. Nothing that can cut the floor in half because you were bored. The growth layer is where diversified risk belongs. The options layer is where a small amount of experimentation can live if you absolutely must have stimulation. Mix those layers and you will eventually punish yourself. This is why so many people feel as though every time they get ahead, they somehow fall back. They are not always cursed. They are often structurally mixing categories that should have been separated. The floor should calm you. The growth layer should compound. The options layer should keep human life from becoming joyless and allow selective boldness. That is a sane design. Now, I want to say something about joy because financial talk becomes stupid when it pretends humans are robots. I am not telling you to become a monk in front of your own savings account. I am telling you to respect sequence. Enjoyment purchased from the wrong layer becomes fear later. Enjoyment purchased from the right layer becomes actual enjoyment. That is a mature difference. If the trip empties the floor, the trip was too expensive for this stage. If the upgrade forces your fixed costs permanently higher and your margin thinner, the upgrade was badly timed. If the option to work less, move, learn, or rest briefly is funded from the options layer, while the floor remains untouched and the growth layer continues, that may be one of the best uses of money possible. Money should improve life. It should not recreate fragility in a prettier apartment. That is another reason the first 20,000 matters. It gives you the first real chance to choose improvement without surrender. Now, what really changes at this level is not the account. It is the nervous system. Fear begins losing automatic authority. That does not make you invincible. It makes you harder to bend at work, harder to bend in sales situations, harder to bend when an app, bank, lender, or marketer tries to package urgency as opportunity. This is why the world gets more aggressive once you become a little more stable. It senses margin. Margin attracts attention. The premium card, the better travel tier, the easier financing, the little luxury repositioned as normal adulthood. The whole machine begins congratulating you for progress while quietly inviting you to convert structural strength back into recurring profit for someone else. That is why I say banks hate your first real reserve, not emotionally, economically. They lose the easiest version of you, the fee version, the revolving version, the cornered version. The most profitable thing the first reserve does is make your next few decisions slower and cleaner. That is why I respect it so much. There is another reason this threshold matters that people rarely discuss. Honestly, it changes your relationship to work. A person with no reserve is not really negotiating with an employer. He is performing obedience under economic pressure. He may use professional language. He may call it loyalty. He may call it patience. Often it is fear wearing office clothes. If the paycheck must arrive exactly on schedule or the whole structure starts wobbling, then the employer has more power over the conversation than either side usually says out loud. This is why people tolerate demeaning managers, impossible scheduling, weak raises, and environments that are visibly wrong for them. It is not always because they lack courage. It is because courage without margin can become self-sabotage. The reserve changes that $20,000 does not make a person untouchable. It does make him harder to corner. That is a big difference. You can ask for a raise more clearly when the answer no longer feels like existential danger. You can search for better work without the panic of needing an instant rescue. You can leave something toxic before it poisons another year of your life. You can choose a role with better long-term trajectory over one with slightly higher short-term pay if the runway exists to make that decision rational. That is what the reserve buys, not luxury negotiation strength. And negotiation strength has a very strange way of producing more money later, because the person who is not negotiating from desperation usually makes better career decisions than the person who is. This is why I never treat the first reserve as dead money. I treat it as invisible leverage. People see cash and imagine inertia. I see optionality. The world looks one way when every decision must protect next Friday. It looks very different when you can think in quarters, years, and deliberate moves. That is a completely different life. It is also why I reject the shallow argument that every spare dollar should always be invested immediately. No, not when the household is still structurally brittle. A person with no reserve and a fully invested account may look disciplined on a spreadsheet and still behave badly in real life because the first real emergency will force a poor decision. You cannot separate investing behavior from cash structure. The reserve protects the investor from having to turn a temporary market decline into a permanent life mistake. That protection matters. So yes, after the first 20,000, the next chapter is ownership, compounding, tax efficiency, and real offense. But before that chapter becomes emotionally sustainable, the reserve has to exist. That is the truth. It is not glamorous enough for the internet. It is powerful enough for real life. And real life is the only scoreboard I care about. And finally, there is one last reason this threshold matters. It changes what you believe about yourself. Before a meaningful reserve, many people think of themselves as the kind of person life happens to. After it, a new identity begins forming. I can absorb things, I can rebuild. I do not need the first bad offer. I can think. I can wait. I can plan. That is not arrogance, that is self-trust with evidence behind it. Evidence matters. The world is full of empty confidence. I trust only confidence built on structure. $20,000 properly understood, but the first real refusal to be the perfect fragile customer for every institution that profits from fear. That is a bigger milestone than people know. And if I were advising someone from the beginning, I would not tell him to fantasize about $1 million before he has crossed the first line where his life becomes harder to monetize through urgency. Cross that line first. For a lot of people, that line is $20,000, then defend it, then build above it. Then let the future begin.